got into rock climbing. Maybe growing up on the prairies, had something to do with that. But I've enjoyed it sporadically since, whether it's been at camp or doing camp ministry or youth retreats. When it comes to helping out at the climbing wall, I found out that 90% of it is just encouraging kids. It's just motivational speaking at the climbing wall, sort of saying, hey, you can do it, try it out, helping them overcome their fear. Because fear can cause us to freeze. And for some, it's just giving them even making an effort to try it out. Getting them to give it a shot, to put the harness on at the start. So there's some who freeze even before they begin to start climbing. And they're just sort of like, nope, I'm not going to do it. And then for others, there are those who freeze on the wall. Now, they might not even be that far off the ground just yet, but they can't seem to move their hand or their foot to that next hold, right? And they're just sort of frozen in place. Even though they're secure, they've got a rope, they've got a harness on, they're frozen. And it's different being on the ground because you can see and you can say, well, just put your hand right there, right? Or just put your foot up to that hold. It's way more different when you're on there, holding on, clinging. It's scary, and you can freeze. And that's what we want to consider this morning, a story about climbing. It's a story about climbing, but actually a story about trust. And when it comes to your life, what does it look like for you to trust in the Lord? We can sing about that, we can talk about it, and say even that I trust in the Lord, but what does it look like? What does it look like for you to put on that harness, or for you to take that next hold, move your foot up or move your hand that next step? Turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter 13. Last week we saw how the heart of King Saul was exposed by his fear of everything that was going on around him. He saw everything going on around him, and his heart, where his heart truly was exposed, and it wasn't with the Lord. And so today, as we read, we get the contrast of that heart. We get to see a heart that is trusting in the Lord and what that looks like. We get a recap sort of the hopelessness of the situation that's going on in 1 Samuel 13. And then we get a picture of a confident servant and an anxious king. And let's begin by getting a bit of a recap of the situation. So we're going to start in chapter 13, and we'll start halfway through verse 15. And Saul numbered the people who were present with him, about 600 men. And Saul and Jonathan, his son, and the people who were present with them stayed in Geba of Benjamin. But the Philistines encamped in Michmash. And the raiders came out of the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. One company turned toward Ophrah and the land of Shual. Another company toward Beth-horon, and another company turned toward the border that looks down on the valley of Zeboim toward the wilderness. Now, we've got a little bit of some geography that we're talking about here, but we're reminded of the situation that happened at the beginning of chapter 13. There's this battle brewing. It's brewing between the Philistines and the Israelites, and it's coming to a head. Soldiers are being mustered from both sides, but it's hardly a fair fight. Right? We remember that Saul, he started with 3,000 men, and that's been dwindled down here, we see, to 600. The Philistines, on the other hand, they have 36,000 men that have been gathered. And this is why Saul chose to disobey the Lord back in last week, because of what he saw and what he put his trust in. And here the narrator describes how the Philistines, they then send out 3 companies, raiding parties, to sort of control the surrounding hillside. And so this is common. They send them out, and they control the surrounding area. But it's not only the numbers that make this situation hopeless. Right? Let's keep reading, beginning in verse 19. Now there was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel. For the Philistines had said, lest the Hebrews make themselves swords or spears. But every one of the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, or his sickle. And the charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshares and for the mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening the axes and for setting the goads. So on the day of the battle, there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people with Saul and Jonathan, but Saul and Jonathan his son had them. And the garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass of Michmash. Now, you don't need to be a military expert to be able to see the advantage the Philistines had when it came to the weapons, right, that they were available. And actually, I saw a couple pictures. Archaeologists have been able to find these bronze casting workshops and smitheries in this area that we're talking about, and from this era that we're talking about as well, sort of confirming what we read here. The Philistines had a monopoly on advanced weaponry going into this battle, to the extent that the Israelites even had to go to them to sharpen their own farm implements and tools. And I can imagine, even with the prices there, they probably, just like us, would be complaining about the prices and how they're changing, right, to sharpen their tools. But we see this drastic difference even in the weaponry available. There's only 2 people in all of Israel who had a sword and a spear, and according to verse 22, who is that? It's Saul and Jonathan. It's the king and his son. So this fight wasn't even when it came to numbers, and it wasn't even when it comes to weapons. But there's one other condition that we want to look at before the action begins. Look at chapter 14, verse 1. One day, Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the Philistine garrison on the other side." But he did not tell his father. Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah in the pomegranate cave at Migron. The people who were with him were about 600 men, including Ahijah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, son of Phinehas, son of Eli, the priest of the Lord in Shiloh, wearing an ephod. And the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. Within the passes by which Jonathan sought to go over to the Philistine garrison, there was a rocky crag on the one side, and a rocky crag on the other side. The name of the one was Bozez, and the name of the other was Senah. The one crag rose on the north in front of Michmash, and the other on the south in front of Geba. Here we get some details on the terrain. And this is sort of a bit of a picture of the area where this occurs in Israel. And you can sort of see this deep valley, this deep ravine, and then we have steep cliffs on both sides. And this is what separated Saul's forces from the forces of the Philistines. They were both sides of this pass, and with each on the heights of each side. So this position would have been extremely difficult to attack or dislodge when you have an elevated enemy, right? You'd have to go down this ravine and you'd have to come up. So the Philistines, they could raid the area at will, and it was a pretty hopeless situation. You consider the numbers, the weapons, the location, but someone was moving. This was a situation that caused Saul to freeze, and what to do, and to fear, even to the point of disobeying the Lord, like we saw earlier in chapter 13, verses 9 through 13. And now it seems to have caused Saul to freeze, and some things just can seem so overwhelming when we look at it. But someone was moving, and we got a hint of that at the beginning of chapter 14. Someone didn't consider this situation to be as hopeless as it seems. Someone saw something else, right, in this equation that was more decisive. And the person was the only other Israelite with a sword and spear than Saul. It was Jonathan. It was his son. See, back in chapter 14, verse 1, Jonathan tells his armor bearer that they should go to the Philistine force on the other side of the pass. And at this point, we don't really know what they're thinking. Maybe they're going to go over there and it's going to be a reconnaissance mission. They're just going to scout. Or maybe they're going to go and test their defenses. All we know is that they didn't tell Saul and the other Israelite soldiers. And this is meant to bring a comparison in our minds between Saul and his son Jonathan as readers. We should start to sort of be making this comparison. And one of the greatest points of contrast between them is Jonathan's initiative, right? Jonathan is the one who, back in the beginning of chapter 13, verse 3, he's the one who initially goes out and defeats the Philistine outpost and starts this whole thing from happening. Right? He starts this whole conflict, and here he is seeking to make things happen again. Let's look at verse 6. Jonathan said to the young man who carried his armor, "Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, by many or by few. And his armor-bearer said to him, "Do all that is in your heart. Do as you wish. Behold, I am with you, heart and soul." You know, these are fascinating verses. And I think they show us the nature of true faith. The first aspect is this willingness, an eagerness even, to step out, to initiate, right? To be active. And secondly, we find that it's an active trust, right? There's this active trust in what? In whom? Well, it's in the Lord. Listen again to Jonathan's powerful confidence at the end of verse 6. He says, "For nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few." See, Jonathan knew the situation. He knew the size disparity of the armies. He knew the disadvantage in the weaponry. He knew the terrain, right? He was familiar with it. But he knew all those things, and he knew something else that mattered, and something that was convinced of. He knew that none of that mattered if the Lord is with him. He was convinced that none of those could hinder the Lord from saving, because the Lord could save with many and the Lord could save with few. But notice that this is active trust that's based in and confidence in the Lord's power, right? In the Lord's power, and it's not blind or sort of wishful. Like Jonathan's he's not hoping against hope that something will happen, that the Lord will save him. He has active trust in the Lord that is based on what Jonathan knew of the Lord, what Jonathan knew of the Lord's character, what Jonathan knew of the Lord's concern and his will. Remember last week, what was the mission of Israel's first king? Remember back in chapter 9, verse 16, the mission was to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines, right? And that the king was to initiate battle while trusting in the Lord. And we see that in chapter 10, verses 7 and 8. Jonathan was doing what the king should be doing. Jonathan was doing what his father should have been doing. And what we see is that he had seen the Lord bring victory in the past. So his active trust was based on God's character and his concerns. Yet he still doesn't presume on how the Lord will carry out his will. Look again at his comment to his armor bearer in verse 6. He says, "Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised." And then he says, "It may be that the Lord will work for us." It may be that the Lord will work for us. This is perhaps the most refreshing aspect of Jonathan's faith. He isn't doubting whether the Lord can save, whether he has power to save through them. He's confessing that God can decide not to. God doesn't have to. He's humbly acknowledging that it's God's will that matters, not his own, in accomplishing it. It's active trust. And so in his active trust, Jonathan surrenders to God's will and submits to it. He steps out in weakness, trusting that God can save if he chooses to or not. You know, Jonathan he goes on to ask for a sign in order to not be presumptuous, right? And so let's look at verse 8. He says, "Then Jonathan said, 'Behold, we will cross over to the men and we will show ourselves to them. And if they say to us, wait until we come to you, then we will stand still in our place and we will not go up to them. But if they say, come up to us, then we will go up, for the Lord has given them into our hand. And this shall be the sign to us.' So both of them showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines, and the Philistines said, 'Look, the Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they have hidden themselves.' And the men of the garrison hailed Jonathan and his armor-bearer and said, 'Come up to us, and we will show you a thing.' And Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, 'Come up after me, for the Lord has given them into the hand of Israel.'" You know, Jonathan is eager to carry out and fulfill what God has set out to do. And notice that last line in verse 12. It confirms his faith in the Lord's ability. What tense in that verb in verse 12? What's the tense that he uses in speaking about the Lord's deliverance? Is it past tense? Is it present tense? Or is it future tense in verse 12? He says, "The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." Past tense. This means in Jonathan's mind, it's as good as happened. The Lord will deliver them. And this is what it looks like to have wholehearted faith in the Lord, actively trusting him in humility. Let's look at the results, beginning in verse 13. Then Jonathan climbed up on his hands and feet, and his armor-bearer after him. And they fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer killed them after him. And that first strike, with Jonathan and his armor-bearer made, killed about 20 men within, as it were, half a furrow's length in an acre of land. And there was a panic in the camp, in the field, and among all the people. The garrison and even the raiders trembled. The earth quaked, and it became a very great panic. Do you know how vulnerable it must have been to climb up to a waiting enemy? Right? They had to use both their hands. They had to put their swords and their spears on their backs, and they had to use both their hands and feet to climb. But when they reached the top, they begin to defeat the Philistines, and panic ensues. And what's amazing is that the trembling that Israel experienced earlier in the chapter, right, in chapter 13, verse 7, this great trembling that happened among the Israelites, this trembling is now visited upon the Philistines. And panic ensues. The Lord works through Jonathan and his armor bearer. It's sort of like the analogy of when you're learning to play baseball. Maybe you're a kid and you can barely hold up the bat, right? It's just so heavy. And your dad takes his arms and he puts them around your arms and he grips your hand in his hand. And he holds on to that bat. And with his swing, you can hit the ball far farther than you ever would have been able to on your own. It's trusting in his ability to take that swing. But you have to step up to the plate. You have to step up. You have to commit. And this is what we see Jonathan doing. And when we don't do that, we're forgetting that we serve in his power. We're trusting in his ability, not ours. Well, the commotion of what's going on across the valley is all of a sudden it's heard by the other Israelites. It's heard by their scouts, and Saul gets wind of it. And so let's see how they respond, especially their king, beginning in verse 16. And the watchmen of Saul in Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude was dispersing here and there. Then Saul said to the people who were with him, "Count and see who has gone from us." And when they had counted, behold, Jonathan and his armor bearer were not there. So Saul said to Ahijah, "Bring the ark of God here," for the ark of God went at that time with the people of Israel. Now while Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the camp of the Philistines increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, "Withdraw your hand." Now we find that we're going to stop mid-action there for a second. Here we have an anxious king. The contrast between Saul and Jonathan in these verses can't be more stark, right? What we find is that Jonathan is active, Saul is passive, right? Saul is waiting when he should act. Jonathan is trusting in the Lord, right? Confident in the Lord's power to save. Whereas here we find Saul is still motivated by fear. He's confident in human power to save. His fear has sort of frozen him in place. And it's interesting, we see that what Saul does with this priest who's there and with the ark. Saul sees what's happening across the valley, and he tells the priest to bring the ark of the Lord near to him. And then look at verse 19. What does Saul do when he hears what's going on in the Philistine camp? In verse 19 again. It says that while Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the camp of the Philistines increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, "Withdraw your hand." So Saul, if you can get this picture of Saul, Saul says, "Okay, bring the ark here." Right? And then all of a sudden, the noise is increasing, and he's like, wait, stop, withdraw your hand. Right? Saul is being controlled by the circumstances. He's using God's priests and the ark in order to manipulate and how he's feeling. Bring it here. No, send it away. Right? Withdraw your hand. Saul doesn't need to consult the Lord with what the Lord's will is, with what he should do. He's already got his marching orders. You know, he should be doing what Jonathan's doing, but unlike his son, accomplishing God's will is not what matters most to Saul. So he shows presumption. He uses the ark and this priest trivially, right, as a means to his own end, with the ultimate authority not being the Lord's, but his own will. Saul's sort of hedging his bets, but it's all about him. And the irony in all of this is that Saul is using a priest, right? The priest that he has on hand is one that's from the line of Eli. It's actually Eli's great-grandson. And as we saw earlier in 1 Samuel, Eli's line has been rejected from serving in front of the Lord because of their disobedience. And here he is serving a king whose line has just been rejected by the Lord as well in our previous verses. And the tragedy is that, as we see here, Jonathan, Saul's son, would have made a fine king over Israel. You know, we find that he's active, he's submissive in his trust before the Lord, pursuing his will above all else. But because of Saul's disobedience, he never will be king. Even still, God is at work. God is using him. Look what happens as the rest of the people join the battle in verse 20. Then Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and went into the battle. And behold, every Philistine's sword was against his fellow, and there was very great confusion. Now the Hebrews had been with the Philistines before that time, and who had gone up with them into the camp, even they also turned to be with the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. Likewise, when all the men of Israel who had hidden themselves in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were fleeing, they too followed after them, hard after them in battle. So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle passed beyond Beth-aven. There is this great victory. But notice what it is that determines the outcome. What is it that determines the outcome? Is it the numbers? No, it's not the numbers, right? We have 2 up against 36,000, or even if you were add 600, it's not the numbers. Is it the equipment? No, it's not the equipment. I love the little added detail in verse 20. Did you catch that? It doesn't matter that Israel doesn't have the best weapons. It doesn't matter that they don't have any swords. Why? Because the Lord uses the Philistines' own swords against themselves. He uses them. And it doesn't matter that the location mattered. No, it doesn't matter either. We notice that the Lord uses the best position against them. It's none of these things that matter. Instead, what matters is the presence of the Lord with his people. You know, the power of the Lord. In verse 23, who is it that saves Israel that day? Definitely not Saul. Not even Saul, Jonathan and his armor bearer, those who mop up after the battle. It's the Lord. It's the Lord who saves. And so our encouragement this morning is to start the climb. It's to start to climb. You know, God uses the active and submissive trust of 2 servants to rout the entire Philistine army. He uses them to bring about this great victory. They knew they were not enough. And yet what mattered more was their faith that God was enough. They knew that they couldn't do it, that they were weak. But what mattered was that God was strong and that they were convinced in his ability, convinced of his strength. So your weakness is a perfect opportunity to experience God's strength. Wherever you feel weak, however you feel weak this morning, maybe you feel weak physically this morning. Maybe you feel weak sort of emotionally. It's been a tumultuous week. Maybe you feel weak in your sin. This is a perfect day to acknowledge your weakness and to trust in God's strength. So how do we do that? Well, it begins with knowing his will and his power to accomplish it. So let's say, you know, what is God's will for me in my sickness? Is God's will for me in my sickness to see me immediately healed and not have to deal with it anymore? Well, maybe, but maybe not. Is it God's will for me in my sickness to use it to make me more like his son? Is it to use it to make me learn patience in the midst of suffering, to develop my character, to become more like Jesus? Yes, it's definitely his will to do that. You know, what is God's will for me in my struggle in sin? Is it for me to be instantly relieved of it and never struggle again? Maybe, but maybe not. Is it God's will for me to experience forgiveness? For me to experience God's love and faithfulness? His steadfast love in my life in the midst of struggling? Yes, definitely it's his will. So can you trust that the Lord is able to provide that for you? Whether it's being physically weak, emotionally weak, spiritually weak, can you trust that God is able to provide what you need to transform your hearts in the midst of that weakness? See, when we surrender to his will, we can be confident in his power to carry out that will in our lives and carry out that will through us. But as we see in our passage, our trust must be active. It must include us stepping out. We must start to climb, to take concrete action. And we've seen this in a number of people being baptized recently. Right? For many of them, that is taking that next climb, making that next grip, taking that next hold, taking that next step. It's vulnerable. It's like climbing hand and foot. And we can start to climb by inviting others into our weakness, not settling like Saul, but trusting like Jonathan. And I love the unity we see from Jonathan's armor bearer. Did you pick that up? Just after Jonathan confesses his confidence in the Lord's ability to save, his heart after the Lord, listen to his armor bearer's response in verse 7. And his armor bearer said to him, "Do all that is in your heart. Do as you wish. Behold, I am with you, heart and soul." You see, as Jonathan's heart follows after the Lord, his armor bearer joins his heart to Jonathan's and says, "I'm with you." He joins his heart to it, and there's this beautiful unity that with others as we pursue God's will together. Seek that. I encourage you to join us in that. This is a bit of an example of what membership entails. The commitment of saying, we are with you, heart and soul. We are together in pursuing God's will. So what does it look like for you to start to climb today? What area do you need to trust in the Lord's power to save and transform? One way we get to apply this passage today is by taking communion together. Communion is an opportunity for us to actively trust in God based on what he's done for us in Jesus Christ. And I'm going to invite our servers to come up this morning, but every single one of us here are putting our ultimate trust in something this morning. Every single one of us here. Some of us are trying to hedge our bets, sort of like Saul, but ultimately we're either trusting in God to make us right and satisfy our hearts, or we're trusting in ourselves to make us right and satisfy our hearts. We're either trusting in God's ability to do that or in our own ability to do that. And what I want us to see is it's less about the grip of the strength of our grip in those moments than the strength of what we're gripping. Tim Keller puts it this way. He says, strong faith in a weak object is fatally inferior to weak faith in a strong object. So strong, confident faith in a weak object or person like ourselves is way worse than having weak faith in the strongest of objects, God himself. And so what we find in our passage is that we're called to cling to the only one who can save us, to cling to the only one who has the ability to save us, to turn to God and to rescue that, to recognize that. And that's what we're doing in communion this morning. We're actively trusting in God's ability to save us from our sin through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on our behalf. And that we've been joined to him. Our union is with him. And through him we've been brought from death to life. And so we in communion, we remember that. We celebrate that. And we trust in God's ultimate victory on our behalf. I'm going to invite our servers to come up. So if you are trusting in the Lord, we invite you to participate with us in the communion this morning.